watching Washington at Work with Diana Longrie. Washington at Work is where we take a look at those issues facing our nation, primarily peace, justice, and jobs. Here at Washington at Work, many of our clips and information come from C-SPAN. C-SPAN has greatly advanced the ability of citizens to watch their federal government at work. There is a vast amount of information regarding Congress's daily schedule. Now, did you know that during the morning that a member can speak up to 5 minutes on any topic? Well, they can. And you know, for the week of February 13th, 2012, many of the topics covered included Medicare, sugar reform, health care, cameras in the Supreme Court, the budget, the president, safe routes to school, and many, many other topics. If you want to have an idea how many times your congressperson has gotten up to speak on various topics, you can go to C-SPAN and they keep track of all the minutes that each congressperson spends speaking on the floor. There has been much news lately about the President's 2013 budget and the testimony before the Senate and the House of Representatives. Now, they have had testimony with regard to the scope, the vision, and the direction of the President's budget. Now, with the Democrats controlling the Senate and the Republicans controlling the House of Representatives, what can the citizens be looking forward to? Can they look towards resolution, or can they expect just another day of gridlock as usual? Well, we typically focus only on what's going on in the U.S. House of Representatives. I've heard parts of the Senate hearing that was held on February 14th, 2012, and I felt that it was important to share with our viewers here of Washington at Work some of the comments that were made, particularly those of Senator Mark Begich, a Democrat from Alaska. So let's listen to what Senator Begich has to say.
Comes to only one conclusion. In fact, the President has acknowledged that mandatory health care spending is the problem, and this President refuses to propose a solution. I think this is extremely irresponsible, and what you are doing with the huge tax increases jeopardizes economic growth while not addressing the fundamental driver of our deficits. I just think this is a huge absence of leadership.
Senator Begich.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's been somewhat entertaining today, and thank you for surviving the first several rounds of conversation. Let me first, just more of a statement, because people who watch this and watch us engage, their assumption is somehow magically, even if we had a budget here, we would vote for a budget, then it would go to the floor, it would be voted on. In theory, the appropriators would follow that budget, and then the President would go forward. That's fantasy land. That's not what happens here. President's budget, this is more, I'm talking to you, to the people who are watching, because they think somehow magic occurs here and there will be this budget process that will lay out the expenditures of the federal government. Actually, the President proposes the budget, we set it aside, we write our own budget, then the appropriators set it aside, and then we appropriate money, and then the President must spend toward the appropriations. Is that a fair?
Yes.
Okay, so it's great all this show and tell that's going on here, but it's not reality. And the poor folks that are watching us believe that we have a budget, we'll take the President's budget, we'll amend it, we'll add, we'll delete, we'll vote on it, appropriators will follow it, then they have a budget. That's not how it works. And it's really somewhat appalling. I know the Chairman has been working on trying to align these things. When the President prepares a budget, then we follow it. So just for the education of the folks that are watching, it's great show and tell today, but the fact is, at the end of the day, it's a whole different process. So I just wanted to make sure in a nutshell. Thank you for that very decisive answer you gave on that.
His comments helped to clarify the budget process to the average citizen. Kudos to him. You know, the President has a budget, and as you heard, well, the President's budget then is looked at, but then it's really then set aside. And this budget, though, the purpose of it, I see, is that he presents as an indication of his priorities, his vision, and the direction he would like the Senate and the House of Representatives to go. Now, of course, the Senate, they produce then their own budget. Now, whether or not if their budget is going to be similar to the president's or different, well, that is part of what they have to put together when they determine what their budget is. And then, of course, the House of Representatives, they have their budget as well. As you heard, they don't modify or amend the president's budget, but that they review it, and then they create their own budget. The budget is basically a plan as to how we are forecasting the money that's going to be needed for particular initiatives or the priorities or the spending that has to be done to have the government operate. The appropriations or the spending of money is separate. Now, as you heard at the beginning of the clip, one Republican senator was posturing and stated his opinion of the president's budget rather than asking the testifier for either clarifications of the budget or either providing objective, constructive analysis based on facts and figures. Now, Senator Begich makes some additional comments to help the citizen put the hearings in perspective. So let's listen to that.
Second, I would like to ask you for a document if you can produce for us. We've done one, but I'd like to get it because I think it's very interesting what we've already seen. President's budget, now over the last several years, when the president proposes a budget, then there's a deficit built into it under the last administration, under this administration. Then CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, goes in some room, magically comes up with another number that they project, and then there's reality at the end of the year. Let me give you an example. In 2008, not under this administration, I'm going to give you one under each one. $2.9 billion budget proposed, deficit $240 billion proposed. CBO says $226 is really going to be the deficit, and actually it was $459 billion. CBO off half, the administration off half. Then just take the following year, $3.1 trillion budget, deficit requested $400 billion. CBO says it's going to go down. 342. Actually, it went to 1.4 trillion. So, you know, I want to make sure, and I want to get a chart if you could produce with those lines. I want to know exactly at the end of the day, we have the numbers, but I want to be confirmed by OMB, the actual expenditure rate.
We can provide that.
Okay. All the way through, go back to 06 through today. What's interesting, when you check the difference, because I heard the comment earlier, surge in spending. I heard that. When I look at the actual budgets, I see, you know, and I'll just use this last 3 years since I've been here, 3.5 trillion approximately, 3.8 trillion, 3.7 trillion, 3.77 trillion. They've actually slid a little bit. Now, surge usually means, you know, I've seen surges.
Right.
When you have a tsunami, it's a surge. It like wipes out things. This is slight increases, and yes, one of those years we had a pretty big one because we're in the worst recession in this country's history. But put that all aside. So if you can show me, because I think the American people need to understand what we're talking about. We use a lot of words around here because it gets headlines, and Political will write something tomorrow on the Hill and roll call and all that. So if you could.
Now, Senator Begich, before becoming a senator, was the mayor of Anchorage. You know, I believe he gets it. It's not just a budget that you look at when you're planning for your future expenditures. It's the actual spending for the year that the budget was in place. And so what you heard is that he was asking for, along a timeline, he wanted to know what was the budget for the year, what was the actual spending for the year, and particularly how close was that budget to the spending. And this is important because if you look at what your budget was and how you spent your money, then you can better budget for the next coming year. because ultimately it's hard to do planning for the next year if you don't know exactly how on target you were. Were your projections in the past, did they fall short? Or did you over budget for particular areas? Or were there certain things that you didn't quite, well, you didn't anticipate? As a past mayor myself, I can identify with his perspective, and I believe his method of analysis is spot on. It's a matter of priorities, projected liabilities, and pre-established contractual obligations. Let me give you an example. My last year as mayor in 2009, I put together a budget for discussion by the council. Now, this budget was separate and different from the budget that was proposed by the city manager. It was the same in many respects, except that I felt it was very important to keep our spending flat because of the economic times. One of the issues that was being faced by the city is that quite a large number of commercial property owners had gone to tax court to appeal their property tax assessment, and that some of those property owners in the previous year had been successful. Now, when they're successful such as that, that means then that the municipality, the school district, and any of the other taxing authorities that received money that was more than what should have been received, they have to give it back. So in my 2009 budget, because I knew that we would have to potentially have to cover that money that we would have to reimburse, I wanted to make sure that that was in the budget. That was something that wasn't planned for in the budget that was proposed by the city manager. They had a contingency pot for contingencies, but not specifically for having to address the property tax appeal situation. As a former mayor, Senator Begich also understands, I believe, that issue of transparency or openness in government and how that pertains to the citizen. Let's listen in.
And just to clarify, you're not replacing the automatic budget cut, or you're suggesting if they hear another route, if the budget cuts don't happen, here's another suggestion. If the budget cuts happen because we're unable to act, they're happening, right?
Absolutely. It's
okay.
Terrible policy.
Okay.
But the President is clear that that forcing function remains.
Right. But if we don't do something, your budget will have to adjust to reflect that.
Yes.
And in some ways, you've tried to do that through another means. But at the end of the day, if we don't act, we don't have the money, you don't spend it.
That's right.
Is that fair?
You're speaking of the sequester.
Yes.
Yes.
I like to say budget
I think it would be a terrible outcome if that's how we did the spending cuts, but
okay.
The President's committed to the sequester.
Okay. I like to say automatic budget cuts because no one understands who's watching TV the other words we use around here.
Transparency has three separate, distinct aspects to it. The information has to be available. Then, to the citizens, is that information accessible? Then, lastly, is that information understandable? Now, as Senator Begich indicated, he said he wanted to not call the sequestering funds. He wanted to rename it as mandatory budget cuts, because that's exactly what it means. As you heard, he did not feel that sequestering properly described it to the average citizen so that they would know what that meant. That certainly that if you called it just simply what it was, automatic budget cuts, that is clearly understandable. And that it simply means that if a budget agreement cannot be reached, these cuts will be made. And as you heard the testifier indicate, he felt that that was a poor public policy. Now, with this background in mind, let's turn to the hearings held by the House of Representatives on President Obama's 2013 budget. first we're going to hear the opening comments from the chair of the Budget Committee, Representative Paul Ryan, a Republican from Wisconsin. It should be noted that Betty McCollum, the Representative Betty McCollum from our Minnesota 4th Congressional District, is also on this committee. Watch the film footage to see if you can spot her.
You're in the position of defending a budget that essentially dodges the most difficult challenges our country faces. The New York Times reported that this budget is, quote, more a platform for the president's re-election campaign than a legislative proposal, end quote. After a careful review of this budget, it's very hard to disagree with that. The Associated Press, accurately in my view, quotes this budget as, quote, takes a pass on reining in government growth. Instead, it leaves the drivers of the debt, namely the unsustainable growth in entitlement programs, largely unchecked. It takes a pass on real reform, even though the looming bankruptcy of these programs threatens to end the guarantee of security that they provide for our nation's seniors. And it breaks the president's promise to cut the deficit in half by the end of his first term. We've heard a lot of excuses from this administration for why the president broke his promise. But what we have not heard is any semblance of accountability. To the best of my knowledge, no one in the White House has taken responsibility for this failure. Instead, we get a blame game that does not stand up to scrutiny. Jack Lew, your former boss, claimed that the reason the Senate Democrats haven't passed a budget in over 1,000 days is because Republicans had threatened to filibuster. Look, this is simply false. We all know, as I'm sure Mr. Lew knows, that budget resolutions cannot be filibustered. They can be passed with a simple majority vote. It's that the Senate Democrats chose not to do so. The real source of dysfunction in the Senate comes from members of the president's own party who have been unwilling for almost 3 years now to go on record in support of his budgets or to pass budgets of their own. More to the point, it wasn't so long ago that the president's party held total control of the White House and both branches of government, during which time the agenda was enacted in near totality. He was able to pass into law massive spending and taxes, the creation of new open-ended entitlements, a regulatory onslaught that is now hurting our economy, and trillions of dollars in new debt. Even after all of this, the new House majority provided him with an opportunity to make good on his promise, to put aside the chronic avoidance of tough decisions, to use the president's words, that he once used to lament. We were and we remain eager to work with the president to stop spending money we don't have, to reform government programs that are not delivering on their promises, and to enact pro-growth policies that raise revenue by getting our economy growing again. Instead of working with us, though, the president has demonized our ideas to save and strengthen health and retirement security programs. He fought to keep his reckless spending spree growing. And he continues to insist on taking more money from hardworking Americans, not to reduce the deficit, but to fuel his ever higher spending increases. The president's ongoing refusal to advance serious solutions to our nation's fiscal challenges represents a stunning dereliction of duty.
Boy, didn't that sound a lot like partisan politics? Sure, he speaks about the serious challenges that our country faces, the debt, Social Security, maintaining national security needs. One moment he talks about the eternal blame game and that it's time to end the blame game, but in the next moment he continues to engage in the blame game rhetoric. Here we are, in part because of both parties. Both are to blame. It's really about priorities and putting the American people first, not the special interests. Do we get our domestic house in order, or do we continue to focus on military actions throughout the world? Do we focus on the needs of the little guy, or do we focus on the industries with the well-heeled lobbyists?
We're not going to give up hope. I remain committed to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle wherever common ground can be reached. Some of us have been doing that. There is growing bipartisan support for reforms that are needed.
Representative Ryan has made a comment to work with the other side wherever common ground can be reached. However, is there a willingness to find the common ground, to stretch the boundaries of compromise and cooperation? Again, it comes down to where they can agree. agree to what the priorities are for our country. I believe that if they listen to the citizens of this country, they will hear loud and clear that the priorities are peace, justice, and jobs. Peace at home in our Congress, and no more wars abroad. Justice in how we take steps for our citizens and not leave them in the cold while the money-funded special interests are inside with Congress where it's warm. And we need to focus on good-paying, long-term, sustainable jobs so folks can pay their mortgages, buy a car, raise a family. We cannot survive, prosper, and move forward as a nation of coffee shops. On a side note, I like his use of the New York Times headline. To make his point, as you will see, it backfires. Let's take a look.
Mr. Zients, I want to add my word of welcome to that of the chairman. I think after your testimony in the Senate yesterday, you're already battle-tested. Welcome to the job, and thank you for jumping into the breach, as the chairman said. And I believe you've gotten off to a very good start. Sometimes we're all guilty of selective quoting. I'll just point out that the New York Times editorial was headlined "A Responsible Budget," and this is a responsible budget that begins to turn the corner in terms of the deficits and is very important in terms of job creation.
That's Representative Van Hollen, a Democrat from Maryland. Let's continue with his comments.
And I think it's important to remind everybody that when the President took office, that he inherited the worst economy since the Great Depression. That's not an excuse. That's a fact. That's just a historical fact. And if we could put a chart up here, you'll see that the red was in the last administration where we were losing jobs rapidly. When the President was sworn in, the economy was contracting at a rate that we now know is 8.9% of GDP, contracting at almost 9% of GDP. 800,000 jobs were lost in January 2009 at the time the President put his hand on the Bible and was sworn in.
I find charts are helpful. Of course, just looking at any statistical tool, you have to understand the assumptions and the data upon which they are based. Congress has to do more than spew political rhetoric or just point to the outcome of the past several years without considering all factors. Congress needs to frankly address why our economy tanked and how was it that the moral hazard engaged in by the Wall Street crowd could have occurred in the first place. With the congressional oversight and the regulators, it shouldn't have happened. Our last clip of Representative Blummer, a Democrat from Oregon. He sits next to Representative Betty McCollum. You'll see her right there with the brown suit coat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Zients. Appreciate your being here.
Thank you.
It's interesting for me to just to have 2 points of reference as I listen to my colleagues go back and forth. One is to look at what is proposed on this by the presidential candidates running for the Republican nomination in terms of more defense spending, no revenue adjustments, and even people like George Will pointing out that it's just an absolute fantasy land, and it'll be fun to watch in the unfortunate circumstance if you have a Romney budget here. When the Republicans were in charge, with the Bush administration, the Republicans, what we were presented every year looked better because it wasn't anywhere near an honest budget. I really commend you and the President for not being in a fantasy land that somehow these overseas adventures are unforeseen, supplemental funding. We're not going to, it's free money, Congress. That somehow we're not dealing with the alternative minimum tax, that we're not dealing with a sustainable growth rate for Medicare reimbursement for physicians. If we did the fantasy budgeting that my Republican friends accepted and in fact participated in with the Bush administration, this $700 billion number would look more like, what, be under $200 billion if you engage in fantasy budgeting, which didn't bother people. I appreciate the notion of looking at some longer-term investments, cost curve. And I think you've got a number of things here that presumably even Republicans and Democrats can agree on. I'd like to zero in on one where there's been some support around this table. The chairman and I have worked on some agricultural reforms in the past, and they were even one of the good parts of his budget. The administration proposes reduction in agricultural subsidies. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Absolutely. I mean, it is a time of strong profitability in the farm sector, and there are direct payments going to some farmers even though they're not producing. Crop insurance, the returns, the IRR on crop insurance is too high, so there are opportunities to save about $30 billion by getting rid of these unnecessary subsidies and at the same time, continuing to have a very competitive agricultural sector.
And you have
That's part of those savings that I mentioned that were part of the other mandatory savings.
This is an area where I think the administration has outlined something that ought to be able, that we on this committee can get behind. We have a farm bill that is expiring September 30th. We can move forward with actually more substantial savings.
Yeah, the exact number in the President's budget, I wasn't off by much, is $32.2 billion, real money that I think makes sense to put into law as soon as possible.
I would hope, Mr. Chairman, that before...
I think that's the one thing we agree with him on.
that this is something that the committee might roll up our sleeves and do some work this year, providing some budget committee leadership. I know you believe in this. The administration believes in it.
The only thing I would say is that...
I just want to say we're fighting sort of a juggernaut on the floor, but I would think that this is something we ought to be able to set our sights on, deliver some real savings, show that we can work together and do something that will help the American public and actually will help more farmers.
If I may just make one, if I may make one point, I do think it's important that as we work together and achieve real deficit reduction, that we do it in a balanced way. So it's important to find savings in agriculture. It's important to find savings in health care. It's also important to get revenue.
Thank you.
So this budget has $2.50 of spending for every dollar of revenue. We need to maintain a balanced approach and not cherry pick here or there.
We've got some time constraints. I appreciate it. Obviously, we disagree with that number, but Mr. Calvert.
Thank you very much for tuning in to this episode of Washington at Work, where we focus on peace, justice, and jobs, and we will continue with the budget discussions next week. Bye-bye.